The crack of a Winchester rifle echoing through the Bitterroot Valley wasn't what broke Caleb Wyatt's heart. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of the woman he loved as she stood beside the man who stole her. Love in the untamed West didn't always die. Sometimes it was taken hostage. The winter of 1883 had locked the Bitterroot Mountains in a merciless, icy grip, freezing the pines until they snapped like dry bones in the midnight wind. For Caleb Wyatt, the bitter cold was a welcome companion. It was predictable. It was honest. Unlike the valley below, the high country offered no sweet promises it didn't intend to keep. Caleb, a man carved from the rugged wilderness he inhabited, moved through the knee-deep snow with the silent grace of a predatory cat, checking his trap lines under the pale light of a weak morning sun. I was a mountain man in the truest sense, broad-shouldered, clad in heavy buckskin and a thick wolf pelt coat, his face obscured by a dense, unruly beard and the brim of a weathered slouch hat. But beneath the hardened exterior of a man who fought grizzlies and survived blizzards, a festering wound lay hidden in his chest. 3 years. It had been exactly 3 years since his world had been gutted, not by a blade or a bullet, but by a woman's sudden, inexplicable silence. Her name was Abigail Preston. Even now, miles above the town of Oakhaven, the mere thought of her name tasted like ash in his mouth. Abby had been the valley's school teacher, a woman with hair the color of polished copper and a laugh that could thaw the deepest winter frost. They had been promised to one another. Caleb had spent a year building a cabin by the edge of Whispering Creek, hewing the logs with his own hands, carving a life out of the frontier for the two of them. They were a week away from the altar when Gideon Reed rode into Oakhaven. Gideon was everything. Caleb was not. He wore tailored Eastern suits, carried a silver-tipped walking cane, and possessed a vast fortune built on copper mining and ruthless land grabs. He bought the town's bank, its saloon, and it seemed to Caleb, its soul. But Caleb never expected Gideon to buy Abigail. The memory played out in Caleb's mind like a worn, tragic play as he pulled a frozen hair from a snare. It had been a Tuesday. Caleb had ridden down to the valley with a winter's worth of pelts to pay for a proper wedding ring. When he arrived at Abigail's boarding house, he found her packing a leather trunk. Gideon Reed was standing by the door, a smug, possessive smirk plastered across his clean-shaven face. When Caleb demanded to know what was happening, Abigail had simply looked away. She hadn't shed a tear. She hadn't fought. She hadn't even offered a word of explanation. She had placed her delicate hand on Gideon's arm and walked out the door, leaving Caleb standing in the dust of his shattered future. Caleb had spent the next 3 years trying to bleed the memory out of his soul. He retreated to the highest peaks, speaking to no one, living off the land, and letting the wildness of the frontier consume the man who had once dreamed of a family. He convinced himself she was just another gold digger, a woman whose head was easily turned by the flash of Eastern money and the promise of a life without calloused hands and wood smoke. But the mountain was running low on game, and Caleb's supplies were entirely depleted. Coffee, flour, salt, and ammunition. The bare necessities required him to do the one thing he swore he'd never do again: descend into Oakhaven. Leading his heavily loaded pack mule, Samson, Caleb navigated the treacherous switchbacks down the mountain. The journey took 2 grueling days. By the time the muddy, rutted main street of Oakhaven came into view, a cold dread had settled into his stomach. The town had grown under Gideon's iron-fisted investments. The wooden false fronts were painted, a new brick bank stood on the corner, and the telegraph wires hummed with the bustling commerce of a growing western hub. Caleb tied Samson to the hitching post outside Miller's Mercantile. The street fell eerily quiet as the townspeople recognized the towering, solitary figure. Whispers rippled through the boardwalk. They knew who he was, and they remembered the scandal. Caleb ignored them, his jaw set, his steely grey eyes fixed firmly ahead as he pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the general store. The warmth of the pot-belly stove hit him first, followed by the familiar scents of oiled leather, ground coffee, and peppermint sticks. Old Man Miller looked up from his ledger, his eyes widening in shock. "Caleb? Caleb Wyatt? Good Lord, boy. We thought the winter had finally claimed you," Miller stammered, nervously wiping his hands on his apron. "Not yet, John," Caleb rumbled, his voice rough and unused. "Need flour, 50 pounds, salt, coffee, and all the 4 for 40 shells you can spare." Caleb was busy unloading his heavy bundle of prime beaver and fox pelts onto the counter when the little bell above the store's door chimed. He didn't turn around, not until he heard the soft, unmistakable rustle of a silk dress, accompanied by the sharp, rhythmic tap of a cane against the floorboards. Every muscle in Caleb's back went rigid. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Well, well, if it isn't the ghost of the Bitterroots," a smooth, arrogant voice echoed through the store. Caleb slowly turned. Standing in the doorway was Gideon Reed, impeccably dressed in a charcoal broadcloth suit, a gold watch chain catching the lamplight. And standing beside him, her arm hooked through his, was Abigail. She was more beautiful than Caleb remembered, yet entirely different. The simple calico dresses she used to wear were replaced by a lavish emerald-green velvet gown that spoke of immense wealth. But it was her face that struck him. The vibrant, laughing woman he had loved was gone. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those bright, expressive eyes, were wide, hollow, and shadowed with an exhaustion that makeup couldn't hide. When Abigail's gaze met Caleb's, she physically flinched, taking a small, involuntary step backward. "I see the savage finally ran out of berries to eat," Gideon sneered, stepping forward to position himself slightly in front of his wife, a possessive, territorial gesture that made Caleb's blood boil. "You should have stayed in the high country, Wyatt. Civilization has moved on without you." Caleb remained silent. His hands rested on the rough wooden counter, his knuckles turning white as he fought the primal, violent urge to cross the room and tear Gideon apart with his bare hands. He looked only at Abigail, searching her face for some sign, some explanation, some hint of regret. But there was nothing, only that same suffocating silence. "Not going to speak, Wyatt," Gideon taunted, mistaking Caleb's restraint for submission. Gideon stepped closer, his cane tapping the floor with a rhythmic, grating sound. He picked up one of Caleb's prime silver fox pelts, inspecting it with feigned disgust, before dropping it onto the floor. "I suppose animals forget how to use words when they spend too long in the dirt. Isn't that right, my dear?" Gideon looked back at Abigail, clearly expecting her to agree. Abigail opened her mouth, her lips trembling slightly, but no words came out. She clutched her small, beaded reticule. So tightly, her knuckles matched Caleb's. Her eyes flicked from Gideon to Caleb, trapped in a silent agony that Caleb, blinded by 3 years of festering rage, misinterpreted as shame for associating with him. The sight of Gideon's boot resting on the fox pelt snapped the last thread of Caleb's monumental patience. In a blur of motion that defied his massive size, Caleb lunged across the distance. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't reach for the heavy Colt revolver strapped to his thigh. Instead, his massive, calloused hand clamped around Gideon's throat with the crushing force of a steel bear trap. Gideon's cane clattered uselessly to the floor. The copper baron let out a strangled, breathless squeak as Caleb slammed him backward. Gideon's spine hit a heavy wooden support pillar with a sickening thud. Caleb pinned him there, lifting the wealthy man until his polished leather shoes dangled inches off the floorboards. "Caleb, no!" Old Man Miller shouted from behind the counter, too terrified to intervene. Caleb leaned in, his face inches from Gideon's. The civilized veneer of the town fell away, leaving only the wild, dangerous predator the mountain had forged. Caleb snarled, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated in his chest, his breath hot and ragged against Gideon's terrified face. "You bought the town, Reed," Caleb whispered, his voice like grinding stone. "You bought the land. You even bought her. But you don't own me. You touch my property again, and I'll snap your neck like a dry twig and feed you to the wolves. Do we understand each other?" Gideon's face was turning a violent shade of purple. His hands clawed desperately at Caleb's iron grip, his eyes bulging with genuine, unadulterated terror. He managed a frantic nod. Caleb prepared to hurl the man to the floor, ready to walk out and never return, when a soft, desperate touch landed on his forearm. He froze. He didn't need to look to know who it was. "Please," Abigail whispered. Her voice was barely a breath, choked and frayed. "Caleb, please, let him go." Caleb slowly turned his head. Abigail was standing right beside him. Her scent, lavender and vanilla, hit him like a physical blow, dragging up 100 buried memories of whispered promises and moonlit walks. But it was her eyes that paralyzed him. They weren't the eyes of a woman protecting the husband she loved. They were the eyes of a hostage pleading for her life. Beneath the terror, there was a profound, frantic warning screaming at him through the silence. For a heavy, agonizing second, the three of them were frozen in a deadly tableau. Caleb stared into the depths of Abigail's terrified gaze, his mind racing. Why was she looking at him like he was the one in danger? With a disgusted grunt, Caleb released his grip. Gideon collapsed to the floor in a crumpled heap, gasping violently for air, massaging his bruised throat as he scrambled backward like a beaten dog. Caleb didn't look at Gideon again. He kept his eyes locked on Abigail. "You made your choice, Abby," he said, the hurt finally bleeding through the anger in his voice. "I hope his money keeps you warm when the winter sets in." He turned his back on them, grabbed his supplies in one massive arm, and walked out the door, the bell chiming a cheerful, mocking farewell. That night, Caleb made camp a few miles outside of town, seeking the familiar comfort of the pines. He built a small fire, the crackling flames throwing dancing shadows against the snow. He sat on a log, nursing a tin cup of bitter coffee, his mind replaying the confrontation at the mercantile. The anger he expected to feel was gone, replaced by a gnawing, unsettling confusion. She was terrified, he thought. Not of me. She was terrified for me. The snap of a twig broke his reverie. Caleb's hand dropped instantly to his holster, his thumb resting on the hammer of his Colt. "Hold your fire, son. It's just an old man with bad knees, a gravelly voice called out from the darkness. Emerging into the firelight was Doc Higgins. The town's aging physician looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped beneath a heavy wool coat, his breath misting in the freezing air. He held his hands up in a gesture of peace. "Doc," Caleb said, relaxing slightly, but keeping his hand near his iron. "You're a long way from a warm bed. Gideon send you to patch up his pride?" Doc Higgins let out a bitter, humorless chuckle. He limped forward and lowered himself onto a stump across the fire from Caleb. He stared into the flames for a long time, the dancing light carving deep valleys of worry into his weathered face. "Gideon Reed is a dangerous man, Caleb. More dangerous than a cornered cougar," Doc finally said, pulling a silver flask from his coat and taking a long swig. "You shouldn't have come back to Oakhaven." "I needed supplies. I'm leaving at first light," Caleb replied coldly. "Don't worry. I won't disrupt your precious, civilized town anymore." Doc Higgins looked up, his faded blue eyes locking onto Caleb with intense, sorrowful urgency. "Do you honestly believe she left you for his money, Caleb? Do you really think so little of the girl you were going to marry?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "She made her choice. She walked out without a word." "She walked out without a word because if she had spoken, you'd be dead," Doc snapped, his sudden anger startling in the quiet forest. Caleb froze, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" Doc Higgins sighed heavily, running a shaking hand over his face. 4 years ago, before you came to Oakhaven, you rode with a cattle crew down in Missouri, didn't you? A crew run by a man named Elias Thorne." Caleb's blood ran cold. He had kept his past buried deep. Elias Thorne's crew had gotten mixed up in a train robbery. Caleb hadn't been part of the heist. He was 20 miles away breaking horses. But the law didn't care. The Pinkertons had cast a wide net, issuing hanging warrants for every man associated with Thorne. Caleb had fled west to start over, changing his name and disappearing into the mountains. "How do you know about that?" Caleb demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I didn't. Not until Gideon Reed found out," Doc explained, his voice steeped in regret. "Gideon employs an army of private detectives to dig up dirt on anyone he considers a threat or an obstacle. When you and Abigail announced your engagement, Gideon wanted her. He found out about your Missouri warrant." The pieces began to click together in Caleb's mind, forming a picture so horrific it made him physically ill. 3 years ago, Doc continued, his voice softening. Gideon cornered Abigail. He showed her the Pinkerton warrant. He told her that if she married you, he would wire the U.S. Marshals, and you would swing from a rope before the snow melted. But if she broke the engagement, if she married him and never breathed a word of the truth to you, he would keep the secret. He bought your life, Caleb, and the price was her. Caleb sat paralyzed. The roaring of the wind through the pines faded into a dull buzz. He remembered the leather trunk. He remembered Gideon's smug smile. But most of all, he remembered Abigail's silence. It wasn't the silence of betrayal. It was the silence of a woman burying her own heart to save his life. Caleb slowly stood up, kicking dirt over the campfire. The flames hissed and died, plunging the clearing into darkness. "Where are you going?" Doc asked, alarmed. "To finish what I started this afternoon," Caleb snarled into the night, checking the cylinder of his revolver. "I'm going to kill him." The blizzard hit an hour past midnight, swallowing the Bitterroot Valley in a blinding, howling fury of white. For the residents of Oakhaven, it was a reason to bar the doors and huddle close to their hearths. For Caleb Wyatt, it was perfect cover. He moved through the whiteout like a vengeful phantom, his massive frame blending seamlessly into the storm. His mind was a tempest of its own, swirling with a lethal mixture of guilt, heartbreak, and unadulterated rage. For 3 years, he had cursed Abigail's name to the empty canyons. He had let the mountain turn his heart to frost, believing she had sold him out for velvet dresses and a warm mansion. He hadn't realized that every day she spent by Gideon Reed's side was a day she spent standing in front of a firing squad meant for him. Gideon's estate loomed on a ridge overlooking the town, a sprawling, ostentatious Victorian mansion built from imported lumber and copper money. It was a fortress of wealth, completely out of place against the rugged Montana skyline. Caleb approached the wrought-iron rear gates, the Winchester lever-action rifle heavy and familiar in his gloved hands. Gideon, terrified by the afternoon's confrontation, had not taken any chances. Through the driving snow, Caleb spotted the glowing tips of 2 cigars. Hired guns. Caleb recognized the men instantly. Jeb Hatcher and Amos Dalton, a pair of ruthless cattle rustlers turned Pinkerton strike-breakers, who Gideon kept on his payroll for dirty work. They were huddled under the overhang of the carriage house, stomping their boots to keep warm. "Boss is losing his mind," Jeb muttered over the wind, pulling his collar up. "Paying us triple to stand out in a squall 'cause of some mountain tramp." "Tramp near crushed his windpipe," Amos replied, spitting a stream of tobacco into the snow. "Keep your eyes peeled. Wyatt ain't normal." They never saw him coming. Caleb dropped from the roof of the icehouse directly behind them. With the brutal, silent efficiency of a cougar taking down a stag, he struck. He swung the heavy walnut stock of his Winchester, catching Amos flush against the temple. The man crumpled into the snow without a sound. Jeb spun around, his hand reaching for the Colt on his hip. But Caleb was already there. His massive hand clamped over Jeb's mouth, driving the man backward into the carriage house wall. Caleb brought his knee up sharply into Jeb's ribs, followed by a swift, precise blow to the jaw. Jeb's eyes rolled back, and he slumped unconscious. Caleb dragged them both into the stables, binding their hands and feet with heavy leather reins. "I wasn't here for them." He slipped through the mansion's rear servant entrance. The air inside was stiflingly warm, smelling of polished mahogany and expensive cigar smoke. Caleb moved silently down the gaslit hallway, leaving a trail of melting snow on the Persian rugs. He followed the sound of pacing footsteps and the frantic clinking of a glass against a decanter. The heavy oak doors to Gideon's study were slightly ajar. Caleb pushed them open with the barrel of his rifle. Gideon Reed stood behind a massive walnut desk, pouring his 3rd glass of bourbon. He looked terrible. His silk cravat was undone, and the dark purple bruises in the shape of Caleb's fingers were starkly visible against his pale throat. At the sound of the doors opening, Gideon whipped around, his eyes widening in sheer panic. "Guards!" Gideon shrieked, scrambling backward and knocking the decanter to the floor, where it shattered into 100 pieces. "Hatcher! Dalton! Get in here!" "They can't hear you, Gideon," Caleb rumbled, his voice dark and deadly. He racked the lever of the Winchester. The metallic clack-clack echoed through the luxurious room like a judge's gavel. Caleb stepped fully into the light. Snow melted from his wolf pelt coat, dripping onto the floor. He leveled the rifle squarely at Gideon's chest. "I had a long talk with Doc Higgins tonight. He told me a very interesting story about Missouri, a hanging warrant, and the price you put on my life." Gideon backed up until he hit the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. His bravado was entirely stripped away, leaving only a cornered, desperate rat. But as his hand brushed against the drawer of his desk, a sickening, triumphant smile began to slither back onto his face. "You think this changes anything?" Gideon spat, pulling a polished, silver-plated Smith & Wesson revolver from the drawer and pointing it at Caleb with trembling hands. "You pull that trigger, Wyatt, and you're a dead man anyway. The warrant is still active. The Pinkertons still want you for that train robbery. You kill me, and you'll hang before spring." Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't blink. The barrel of his Winchester remained perfectly steady. "I'm already dead, Reed. I died 3 years ago when you took her from me. Now, I'm just returning the favor." Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. "Caleb, stop!" The voice sliced through the tension like a straight razor. Abigail stepped from the shadowed alcove, still wearing her green velvet dress. Her copper hair fell loose around her shoulders, and the fear she'd shown at the mercantile was gone. In her trembling hands, she held a thick, black leather ledger. Caleb's breath caught. "Abby, get out of the way." "No." She stepped between Caleb's rifle and her husband. "If you kill him, they'll hang you. I didn't spend 3 years in this purgatory just to watch you throw your life away tonight." "Move aside, Abigail," Gideon shouted, emboldened by her presence. "Let the savage hang himself." She ignored him, keeping her tear-filled eyes fixed on Caleb as she slowly raised the ledger. "Do you know how Gideon made his fortune, Caleb?" she asked, her voice steadying. "Do you think a man like him struck copper by swinging a pickaxe?" Caleb lowered the Winchester a fraction of an inch, confusion warring with his anger. "What are you talking about?" "3 years ago, he blackmailed me with a warrant from Missouri," Abigail continued, taking a step toward Caleb. "He told me you rode with Elias Thorne's gang, but what he didn't tell me, what I spent the last 3 years trying to prove, was why the Pinkertons were so desperate to find Thorne's crew." Gideon's face went completely white. The silver revolver in his hand shook violently. "Shut your mouth, Abigail! Shut it right now!" "Thorne wasn't just robbing trains, Caleb," she said, ignoring Gideon completely. "He was working for a financier, a man who needed seed money to buy up land rights in the Bitterroot Valley. A man who hired Thorne to steal federal payrolls and then had Thorne's men hunted down to cover his tracks." Abigail slammed the ledger onto a mahogany side table. "It's all in here. Every payoff, every stolen dollar laundered through the Oakhaven Bank. Every name of the men he ordered, killed to keep his secret." "Gideon didn't just know about the Missouri warrant, Caleb. He was the one who funded the robbery you were framed for." The revelation hit Caleb with the force of a physical blow. He stared at the man, cowering against the bookshelves. Gideon wasn't just a romantic rival. He was the architect of Caleb's entire misery. "Give me that book, Abigail!" Gideon screamed, lunging forward, his gun raised. Caleb moved instinctively, stepping in front of Abigail and raising his rifle. But before a shot could be fired, the heavy oak doors of the study burst completely open. "Drop the weapon, Reed!" Standing in the doorway, shaking snow from his heavy canvas coat, was Sheriff Cobb. Flanking him were 2 men Caleb didn't recognize, men wearing the brass badges of United States deputy marshals, carrying double-barreled scatterguns leveled directly at Gideon. Gideon froze, his eyes darting frantically from the marshals to the window, realizing there was no escape. Slowly, defeatedly, the silver revolver slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the floorboards. Sheriff Cobb stepped into the room, kicking the gun away. He looked at Abigail with a mixture of awe and deep respect. "We got the telegraph confirming the package arrived, Mrs. Reed." Judge Isaac Parker reviewed the documents you sent on the Wells Fargo stage last month. Cobb turned his hard gaze to Gideon, pulling a set of heavy iron cuffs from his belt. "Gideon Reed, by order of the federal court in Fort Smith, you are under arrest for conspiracy, grand larceny, and the murder of Elias Thorne. The Pinkertons have been looking for the man bankrolling those heists for half a decade." As the federal deputies roughly seized Gideon and dragged him toward the door, Gideon turned back, his face twisted in venomous hatred. "You're a dead man, Wyatt. The warrant—" "The warrant is null and void," one of the deputies interrupted, shoving Gideon forward. "Judge Parker signed a full pardon for Caleb Wyatt this morning. Turns out, when you keep a ledger detailing how you framed innocent men to cover your own tracks, the courts tend to clear their names. Let's go, Reed." The heavy doors closed behind them, cutting off Gideon's frantic swearing. The silence that fell over the study was heavy, but for the first time in 3 years, it wasn't suffocating. Caleb slowly lowered his rifle, letting it rest against the desk. He looked at Abigail. The sheer magnitude of what she had done crashed over him. She hadn't betrayed him. She had sacrificed her freedom, her reputation, and her happiness, stepping into the cage with a monster so she could dismantle him from the inside. She had endured his hatred, the town's whispers, and Gideon's cruelty, all to save a man who had abandoned her to the mountains. "Abby." Caleb's voice broke. The fierce, untouchable mountain man shattered. He took off his slouch hat, falling to his knees on the Persian rug in front of her. His massive, calloused hands reached out, gently hovering over hers, as if he were afraid he might break her. I thought you stopped loving me." Tears finally spilled over Abigail's lashes, tracking down her pale cheeks. She fell to her knees off the side of the table, collapsing against Caleb's chest. "I never stopped, Caleb," she sobbed into the thick fur of his coat, her fingers gripping his buckskin shirt, as if he might vanish into the snow again. "Not for a single day. But he was going to hang you. I had to make you hate me, so you would stay away. I had to keep you alive." Caleb wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her copper hair and breathing in the lavender and vanilla scent he'd dreamed of through countless cold nights. The ice around his heart finally melted in her embrace. "You're the bravest person I've ever known," he whispered, kissing her head. "I'm sorry I didn't see it. I'm sorry I left you alone." "You're here now," Abigail murmured, meeting his steely eyes. "Take me home, Caleb. Take me to the mountain." Outside, the blizzard raged. But Caleb no longer felt the cold. He lifted Abigail into his arms, and together they left the mansion behind, the wealth, the lies, and the ghosts. As they disappeared into the snow toward Whispering Creek, Caleb finally had his heart back, and their silence was broken forever. If you were on the edge of your seat watching Abigail outsmart a ruthless tycoon to save the man she loved, hit that like button right now. True frontier grit isn't just about surviving the wild. It's about the incredible sacrifices we make for love. Want more heart-pounding Wild West stories, thrilling showdowns, and epic historical dramas. Share this video with a friend who loves a good plot twist, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on the action.